from the Coral Island, Treasure Island, and the whole genre. I loved it. I'm not a particularly adventurous person. I grew up in Dublin, surrounded by concrete streets and buildings and very little wilderness around. But these books opened up an imaginary of a wilderness, of the world beyond the world that is known. And they also spoke to a time when the world was unexplored, unexploited, and it had to be traversed by sea. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, understand? So it wasn't anything like getting on a €10 Ryanair flight to the wilderness. If you wanted to go somewhere, it was going to take a long time. It was going to be an arduous journey and full of hazards and adventures. So I think one of the things that appeals to us about the story of Shackleton and the polar explorers is the heroism, the sense of adventure, the odyssey that's involved. So when I was thinking about this talk today, I looked into the whole kind of myth of the hero's journey. It was a famous book written by John Campbell back in 1949, where he sets out the 17 stages of the hero's journey. And I won't go through them all, but they're sort of obvious to us if you think about all the myths and legends and adventures that you know. The idea of the hero being selected. Why me? Why am I the one who has to do this big journey? And the journey itself, the trials into the underworld, some form of supernatural aid, and the beginning of a personal transformation, challenges, temptations, and there's usually something about a woman there in the midst. Revelation, confronting death and rebirth, and then finally atonement and return. So it always begins as a call to head off into the unknown, which of course is a psychological drama as well as a geographical one. And Campbell describes it as a distant land, a forest, a kingdom underground, beneath the waves or above the sky, a secret island, lofty mountaintop, or profound dreams state. And somewhere along the way, there's usually a magical helper. I think in our case, that might be someone like James Caird. And along the way, the hero journeys into the belly of the whale. The passage of the magical threshold, the hero is swallowed and appears to be dead. So it's kind of fascinating to think about Shackleton's adventures, not just the endurance, but the others as well, as kind of falling into that kind of pattern. And that's, I think, something that explains our fascination with his story. And it's not the only one. I was thinking as well of the Thai caves rescue and the fascination with that. It took 10,000 people and their different resources and skills and expertise to get those boys out of the cave. It was a source of fascination, and for the same reason that it falls into this kind of pattern of heroism and myth. But it's not that the story of endurance or Shackleton fits the hero narrative perfectly, because he's a flawed man, we know that. It's that we project so much onto those real events, trying to decipher their meaning, trying to decode the amazing story of survival, trying to learn what it tells us about the human condition. And so, again, researching for this lecture, I came across all these books on management and leadership that reference Shackleton, which I think would have been hilarious to him, given his utterly dismal failures on the business side of things. But what are the human qualities that come into play under extreme stress? And of course, when it comes to climate change, there are so many lessons we can learn from Shackleton directly. But there's a few things I would just like us to kind of be slightly critical of, given that we are looking at these events from the distance of 100 years and everything that's happened since then. So back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, these were largely unknown parts of the world, unmapped. And it wasn't just that there was a desire to map them and know them, but there was also a desire to conquer them. Polar explorers were almost childishly competitive with each other and taking risks that perhaps under modern health and safety guidance they wouldn't dream of taking in order to be fastest, the longest, the ones with or without various gadgets. And a lot of risks were taken to try to, beat the record as fast as possible. But for what purpose? It wasn't always a scientific agenda that was driving them. That was always part of the mission, but it wasn't the central concern of the mission at the time, unless I'm completely wrong. And it's hard to escape the reality that all those amazing names that we associate with Antarctica are named after those explorers and the people who lent them money. So Shackleton, unfortunately, was not very successful in business. His ideas and plans didn't work out, and he had a kind of whimsical approach to some of these business ideas. They seemed to be excuses to travel and have more adventures. But there was also something behind some of the business ideas he had that were about looking for this kind of quick fix or pristine resource that could be turned into a successful business. That was completely normal at the time, of course. But I think we would want to be somewhat critical of that kind of what we would call extractivist mentality now, knowing what we know about the destruction that we've wreaked on the earth in the past 100 years, and how much of that is traced to that kind of colonial mentality. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is it's important not to deny the connection between that adventuring instinct and the colonising impulse. But having said that, Shackleton is an incredible inspiration. He's clearly a flawed individual, but there's even just one of the stories about him and his extraordinary kindness and generosity and leadership would be enough to put him, in a museum all by himself, never mind the endurance. And famously, it stands out for me, the episode on the Nimrod expedition, when they're turning back from 97 miles from the pole, good judgment call, and he gives Frank Wilde his rations. They're all suffering from starvation and dysentery. So nobody could afford to give away rations, but he did. And of course that explains Frank Wilde's unswerving loyalty to Shackleton after that. But what an extraordinary gesture. How many of us can honestly say we would be able to do that under those conditions? You're at your limits as a human being, and yet he went beyond. So the obvious courage of Shackleton, venturing into the unknown, inhospitable climate, hardships, no helicopter rescues, no insurance, they didn't even have the right gear. I'm just amazed, and I love the statue because of the way it captures those kind of baggy Burberry outfits that they wore, and it's just impossible to imagine that they would have been able to give the men the warmth that they needed, whatever about protection from other elements. And it's also worth remembering, and you guys probably all know the old stories, that the Endurance was his third trip to Antarctica, and he nearly died on both of the other ones as well. So the ability to go that close to death and venture back each time, rebuild the expedition, it's just extraordinary. And the third one didn't, of course, nearly didn't happen, but for last-minute donations by key backers. And looking back on it, you would have to say, God, what a mad project that was. It was, as I say, it wasn't driven by a sort of scientific impulse particularly, and it was quite a mad project. But nonetheless, Shackleton's ability to respond as he did in the crisis is irrefutable. And we can and should pay attention to all of it, because we are going to be tested collectively and individually. And if not directly ourselves, our children are going to be, and we need to be thinking about what skills to impart to them. The obvious ones that Shackleton can teach us about are people management, this rigorous attention to detail, monitoring everything around him every day, and it was a team effort, whether it was weather, the condition of the animals, the morale of the men. There was no room for wishful thinking. And there was an incredible discipline, yet an egalitarian ethos throughout. Nobody was more or less important than anybody else. Routines, preparedness, and rationing. And when the going gets tough, The extraordinary attribute of Shackleton was his care of the men. He seemed to know what each man needed and would approach them individually to kind of sound them out and talk to them and figure out what kind of reassurance or comfort he could provide. And some of his biographers do refer to this as a kind of maternal ethic of care that he brought with him. And again, when you consider the circumstances and that he was suffering the hardships alongside them, this was an extraordinary strength of character. Always good-humoured, always positive attitude, and even when things looked hopeless. But they never dwelt on that. And his memoirs are quite extraordinary in their focus on the day-to-day practical reality of survival, and not allowing themselves to get sidetracked by wishing they hadn't done things that can't be changed, or dreaming to scenarios that they couldn't make come about. They just had to focus on what was possible in the moment, when they were utterly powerless, floating on the ice, trapped in the ice, being brought to God knows where. I was thinking of a book I read recently by a woman called Elaine Scarry. She's actually an English literature expert, but she wrote a book about thinking in an emergency. And she has 4 kind of typologies of reaction, but the one that I really like and wanted to mention, and it might not seem directly relevant, is her focus on CPR. You all know CPR. It's, resuscitation. When somebody's suddenly struck with a heart attack, it's the set of practices that we're all supposed to know that will keep them alive, get breathing going again, get the heart going again. But in order for that to be remotely effective, given the randomness of heart attacks in the population at any given moment, you need to have a diffusion of this skill throughout society. That's why it's taught in the Boy Scouts, it's taught as a first aid, and you have to replenish your training every couple of years because you forget and they update the guidance. But the point about it is that in an emergency, you have to have the skill of acting swiftly and decisively. Delaying, ringing somebody, consulting a book, no use. So when there's a climate crisis, don't consult the climate expert. Consult the person who knows how to manage energy, in the given place where you are. So I love that approach to thinking in an emergency. It's the practical skills that matter. So on the Endurance, when they were trapped in their desperate situation, trapped with each other as well, you can imagine it was extremely stressful. No one was a burden. Everybody had a job. There were awful conditions, and it's clear when you read through the different versions of the stories that as the boats were launched and they started to head towards Elephant Island, that even though it doesn't feature kind of prominently, but if you read closely, quite a number of the men were breaking down. And then on the second trip from Elephant Island over to South Georgia, I think 3 of the 6 men broke down on that trip as well. So you can only imagine the psychological impact of the journeys. They were already at their limits and they were being tested and tested and tested. And Shackleton wasn't even the physically strongest of them. That's the extraordinary thing. He seemed to do without sleep, and yet it's known that he had a heart condition. But he led nonetheless. He didn't let his personal weaknesses get in the way of what was required. We all know the story of what happened, so I won't tell the story, even though it's a beautiful story to tell. But some little stories within that stand out. The point when they're trekking across the mountain in South Georgia, where they're exhausted, they've already been marching for 26 hours or 30 hours, and the men sit down and they just immediately fall asleep. Shackleton doesn't let himself fall asleep. He knows that if they do, they'll be dead. They have no provisions, no tent, no protection from the elements. So the men fell asleep, and he woke them up after 5 minutes and told them that they'd been asleep for half an hour. And of course that gave them the boost that they needed to keep going. And apart from the genius of knowing to do that, he deprived himself of the 5 minutes. And that is an extraordinary act of sacrifice under these incredibly difficult conditions. I mean, just unimaginable. He never let his guard down. South is an amazing record, even if it's slightly maybe embellished by the ghostwriter, but it reveals his total focus on the task at hand on a daily basis. Not afraid to change the plan, but attention to detail. Shifting ice, cracks, melting, weather, the conditions of the dog and men, and the ship itself, of course, when they were still in the ice. There was no self-pity, no wishful thinking, into action. So it's easy to imagine group breakdown. There's loads of other examples in history of that happening. Mutiny, collapse of discipline and order. So the story culminates not just in the escape to Elephant Island, but also in 4 separate rescue missions to retrieve the men from, well, South Georgia first and then Elephant Island. So what can we learn from this for the climate crisis? Well, the important message that I have for you is that what we need as a psychological response to the climate crisis is not hope, it's courage. And there's different types of courage. There's the kind of courage that Shackleton has demonstrated that we can learn from, the examples I gave you, self-sacrifice and leadership, motivating others, taking care of people, treating them as equals, minding everybody, no one was left behind. But there's different kinds of courage. And there's also the courage of being left behind. It's hard to read as a woman the story of Shackleton without grieving for Emily, because her treatment was really quite shameful. Humiliation, financial insecurity, infidelity, but she was an incredible woman in her own right. And it takes great courage under those conditions to just get up every morning and make the breakfast, get the kids to school. And the reason I mention this is because in the climate crisis, there will be heroes who will go out and do things, get on boats and rescue people who are trapped in floods, but there are women and children and elderly people who will be trapped. We call them in the literature trapped populations, or fancy language, gendered immobility. The idea that women in certain countries, because of various cultural and religious taboos, can't leave their homes and rescue themselves without a male companion, or perhaps due to inappropriate clothing or an inability to swim, which brings us back to the CPR. Basic skills, everybody should have them. So this is a known feature, and in fact even in the recent floods in Pakistan, it was a real problem in certain parts of Pakistan where there was a cultural taboo on women leaving the house, even to save their own lives. And that was a big part of the problems there facing communities. But interestingly, in Bangladesh, where it's also been an historical problem, women have kind of responded to that by setting up kind of women-centred rescue centres or kind of shelters that women feel safe going to. And then they teach the women how to get there and support them in getting there. But they're not just left to their own devices. So let's talk about Antarctica. The news is not good, I'm afraid. Now, if you read the history, as I'm sure many of you do, the glaciers in Antarctica started forming 45 million years ago. And the ice sheet was well and truly established by about 20 million years ago. So think the Holocene, this period of atmospheric stability that has allowed us to flourish as a species with agriculture and settlements, is only 10,000 years long. And here's another number. More than 50% of the global emissions that are driving climate change and that are in the atmosphere, baking in future climate change, have been emitted in the last 25 years. It's quite extraordinary. So glaciers across the world are in rapid retreat, and this is as a result of emissions that would have been released 100 years ago and 50 years ago, not the ones that were released in the last 25 years, because there's a lag effect for them to take effect. The area covered by Arctic sea ice has diminished by 40% since the 1980s. And the rate of sea level rise, which is now, it seems like nothing, 5 millimetres per year, is actually 4 times the rate it was between 1900 and 1990. And the problem is that the rate itself is accelerating. Now, the Antarctic ice sheet contains 2/3 of the planet's fresh water, and if it all melted, which is unlikely, it has to be said, that would yield 58 metres of sea level rise. And just think about the impact on almost all coastal cities would be wiped out. 58 metres of sea level rise. Now that kind of event, even if it was triggered over the next century, would take thousands of years to happen. But don't we have a duty to think in those terms, in those time frames? We are seeing nearly 220 billion tonnes of ice melting from Antarctica alone annually. And if that melting rate continues to accelerate, the annual rise by the 2040s could be 5 centimetres per year. Again, it doesn't sound like much, but in a storm surge, that's enough to wipe out Miami, for example. And there's 2 separate ice sheets in Antarctica that are separated by the Transantarctic Mountains. You've got the East Antarctic ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. And the vast majority of the ice is locked up on the east side. And that's considered to be less at risk at the moment. The West Antarctic ice sheet is what is keeping the thousands of scientists in Antarctica busy. No more exploration. It's all about climate change now. So the West Antarctic ice sheet is smaller. It covers the Antarctic Peninsula, that little bit of land that sort of points upwards towards South America. And it's quite unstable. It could potentially collapse, and it could potentially collapse very quickly in ways that scientists can't accurately model and estimate. The ice melting is being accelerated there, not just by the rising air temperatures, but also by warmer oceans because of the geography of the ice sheet itself. So it all depends on the floating ice sheets of the Ross Ice Shelf, the Ron-Filchner Ice Shelf, and also 2 really important glaciers on the West Antarctic ice sheet, the Pine Island and Thwaites Glacier. Pine Island Glacier has the potential to add ½ a metre to sea level rise, and the Thwaites, of course, a bit more than that again, 65 centimetres to the level of the oceans. Each one of those would be catastrophic. But the problem with the Thwaites Glacier, and it's called the Doomsday Glacier, because its collapse could promote the collapse of the neighbouring glaciers and allow the ice sheet to just tumble into the sea. And there's really nothing that anybody could do to prevent that. Even if you brought global emissions down to 0, once that process is underway, my understanding is that it just can't be reversed. So that's why we call them tipping points. And the latest research suggests that a tipping point is approaching, beyond which wholesale melting is inevitable. Some scientists think that the Thwaites Glacier could go in the next 5 to 10 years. And the scariest prognosis of all is the potential collapse of the East Antarctic ice sheet. It's not something that scientists think would happen, but if it melts, all bets are off. Now, I haven't even mentioned the other tipping points. The Greenland ice sheet, the fate of the Amazon, tropical coral reef die-off, northern permafrost abrupt thaw, Barents Sea ice loss, Labrador Sea current collapse, mountain glacier loss, and of course the Hindu Kush glacier, regime, I suppose, supplies water to billions of people in India and China and in that general Himalayan area. Millions and billions of people, essentially, depending on that. So the Atlantic current, of course, could be disrupted. Arctic winter sea ice collapse. These are all called tipping points because they're essentially irreversible, and because they have not only devastating consequences directly on the populations close by, or in the case of the Atlantic current, that would give us a complete regime shift in terms of Ireland and North Europeans' weather patterns, but also because they act as feedbacks into the climate system. So they act as drivers of other change, other Earth system change, that, again, we wouldn't be in a position to control. So it's all pretty depressing, I'm afraid. I know Kevin, when he invited me, he said, try to keep it upbeat. Well, Kevin, I don't think you've been reading the news. Because we know what's driving all of this. We know, there's no doubt about it. The science is unequivocal that the causes are, to the most significant extent, the combustion of fossil fuels. and also deforestation, land use and land use change. We're still releasing about 34 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, gigatons, per annum. And although there was a slight dip of about 5.6% during COVID, and just remember back when that was going on, it felt like nothing was happening. And surely emissions must crash, but they didn't. Transport emissions dropped, aviation emissions dropped, but the rest of the economy just sort of ticked over. And 5.6% emission reduction was all that was experienced globally. Now, there's lots of good news there is in terms of the rollout of renewables, not just the level of penetration into the energy system, because they're of course clean, carbon neutral, or sort of zero carbon once it's paid its carbon debt back, if you like. So the penetration is increasing, and that's welcome. We need to obviously accelerate that. And the costs of it are coming down dramatically. But the reality is that wealthy countries are still not taking enough efforts to decarbonise fast enough to make a difference. It's no point having a target of 2050 if what we're doing in the next decade is what really counts. The latest report from UNEP, the Environment Programme of the United Nations, warns that there's really no pathway now possible to 1.5 degrees based on the current commitments that countries have made in advance of the next COP in Egypt. Now, what 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like very much. When people hear that, they think, well, sure, it was sort of 15 degrees yesterday and 17 degrees today. What's the difference? That doesn't sound like climate change. But you have to think of it like core body temperature. The human being core body temperature is about 37 degrees. Now, if you had an elevated body temperature of 38, 39 degrees for an extended period of time, and then you added another degree, what would happen? You'd soon approach a situation where your organs would start failing. And that's what's happening to the planet Earth. Planet Earth's organs are starting to fail. And whatever about their commitments, countries that have made ambitious commitments aren't even delivering on them, and that includes Ireland. So our climate law commits us to reducing emissions by 51% by 2030. And some people argued, incidentally, that that isn't high enough, that as a developed country we should be doing even more so that poorer countries have an opportunity to use more fossil fuels to ensure they have adequate health and education and so on, basic infrastructure. But 51% is an onerous target. It was broken down into 3 carbon budgets, with 2 up to 2030, but we're way off target. And there's still massive rows all the time in terms of who should be doing what. When in fact we need to acknowledge that everybody needs to be doing an awful lot more than they're currently doing. And emissions are actually rising in Ireland because of the fact that we're using more coal now to make up for the shortfall in gas and the cost of gas. Which is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I was involved for years in energy policy and climate policy, and we fully expected Moneypoint to be closed at this point. And each time some crisis comes along and the date is deferred, because of course coal is the most carbon intensive fuel. Now of course the crisis in Ukraine has put the focus on rapid decarbonisation and getting us all weaned off Russian gas and fossil fuel imports, given the extraordinary price shocks that have resulted from that. But the reality is that many countries are leaning back into a kind of energy nationalism. Well, let's start fracking again, or let's start exploring for oil again. We need to have our own energy supplies, because look, you can't trust anybody else. We don't want to be shipping oil and energy in from Saudi Arabia any more than we don't want to be doing it from Russia. But the reality is that there's no single project to explore and develop more fossil fuel that is consistent with the 1.5 degree pathway. And again, in case I haven't emphasised it enough, 1.5 degrees would certainly drive the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. That would be entirely consistent beyond 1.5 with the loss of the Greenland ice sheet and good chunks of Antarctica's ice sheets as well. So in Ireland we declared a climate emergency. The Dáil declared it at least in 2019, but nothing much has really happened. Nobody's been told. Have anybody received a little booklet in the door saying, you're now in a climate emergency and this is what we'd like you to do? Or these are the things that you might consider doing. Nobody's actually asked you to consider energy improvements to your home if you're in a position to do that, or to shift towards using your bicycle or walking or public transport, or what your options are in the case of electric vehicles and so on, if that's feasible. But nobody's even being told this. You're relying on advertising on the radio to get a sense of what's actually possible out there. And of course people are confused, and I think, well, if companies are telling us to do this but not the government, well, that's not really a good reason to do anything. All of this is a kind of form of cognitive dissonance. And as we know from the Shackleton story, and this is where I go back to Shackleton, it's psychologically painful to maintain this much cognitive dissonance. The idea that it's possible for us to keep growing and consuming, keep adding more wealth, keep traveling, keep the cheap flights, keep all of that, those industries that are so energy intensive, grow, and at the same time trying to comprehend the catastrophic impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss that are happening right now. The world that we knew, that our grandparents knew, is disappearing. But ignoring climate change as a way of avoiding despair is giving into fear. And as one commentator I noticed today actually on Twitter was saying, well, you know, fear, rage, anger, these are all productive emotions. So despair is not the only option here. It's okay to be angry. They drive us to act. And these emotions drive us to demand action from others who are better placed to act. So in the last week I've been reading this wonderful book by the Icelandic author Andri Magnusson called On Time and Water. I'd highly recommend it to anyone interested in glaciers and cold places. And the interesting thing about Andri, he's a writer, a fiction writer, he's done some science fiction, but up until about 2005 he had 5 living grandparents who were very elderly. So he had the most incredible resource available to him, and he interviewed them and taped his discussions with them. And he had one really fascinating interview with his 10-year-old daughter present, and they worked out that if his daughter lived to the age of his grandmother and had her granddaughter with her, that time span between the eldest and the youngest would be something like 160 years. So that's a sense of the connectedness that we have to the people we love, that it's not just about people in the room on any given day. Our love can extend beyond generations. When you think about the interests of future people, we have to bear that in mind. So in the summer of 2019, Magnusson was given the strange task of writing a memorial for the, I can't pronounce it properly, the Ukjökull glacier, the first of hundreds of glaciers in Iceland that are going to be lost in the next 200 years. And he asked himself, well, how do you say goodbye to a glacier? So this is what he wrote. Uk is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument acknowledges that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. And I think that's very powerful. And that's actually printed on or inscribed on a plaque at the site where the glacier used to be. So instead of eulogizing our polar explorers, we can take inspiration from them, but we need to start eulogizing the ice itself, because it's melting. We need to acknowledge our interdependence and our need for healthy ecosystems and other species for our own survival. We need a creative imaginary that helps us to remember what is important, beautiful, and sacred. So thank you.
So we have time for a couple of questions before we break for coffee. Any questions for Sadbh?
the likes of Brazil, USA, China and Russia fail to meet their targets, is Ireland wasting their time?
It's if Brazil, China, and what was the other country you mentioned?
USA and Russia.
USA. If they don't live up to their commitments, the planet as a whole is in serious trouble. Absolutely. The strength of the Paris Agreement is that it builds a regime based on cooperation between all countries, developed countries and developing countries. And every country has to do their part. So if you look at the contribution of developed countries to historical emissions, and it's because carbon dioxide stays so long in the atmosphere, what was put into it over the last 100 years is enormously important, as well as what has been put into it in the last decade or this year. So developed countries have contributed the lion's share of historical emissions. Now, they are being caught up on by China for sure, and there's no question about it. If China doesn't play ball, we are all in serious trouble. But the whole regime is built on the concept of reciprocity. I will if you will. And if we, the rich developed nations of the world, can't demonstrate that we can decarbonise our economies, we have absolutely no prospect of encouraging poorer countries that are on a development trajectory of one sort or another to do likewise.
Hey, it's not really a question per se. I'm just kind of interested if you have comments on the, it can be kind of hard to feel as an individual. You're doing all the right things, you've got your takeaway cup, your reusable cup, and you're getting an electric car and all this. But it can still feel like you're not making a difference because, say, big companies in Ireland or USA or wherever aren't doing their part. So I guess I'm just interested in your kind of feelings on that dichotomy,
Brilliant. No, I love that because you're absolutely right. But even the way you're describing it, it's as if we're only hearing that the changes we can make as individuals are as consumers. But we're not just consumers. We are teachers. We are professionals. We are parents. We are grandparents. We are citizens. We can organise together. We can act collectively in many, many different ways, and we can motivate ourselves and other people to act. So it's not just about what we do with our money. That's only one tiny part of it. But the system change that really matters is a much bigger social and political change. So sometimes the acts that we take as individuals make insignificant difference to the whole picture. So you just stop driving and you start cycling and, everybody's laughing at you. God, look at your one out in the rain, isn't she mad? But what you're doing is you're taking a form of symbolic action that might actually eventually be normalised. And all of the social science research shows that once you have a significant minority of people doing things openly and making it normal, then it becomes normal for everybody, even the people who are not doing it. So I would say we can't discount any form of action. We can't discount civil disobedience. We can't discount, incorporating climate change into our education system. Every type of action matters, because every fraction of a degree matters.
One more question, maybe?
Thanks, Simon. It was a really interesting presentation. Would you have anything to say in terms of ESG for companies?
ESG, environmental and social governance. At its best, it's a kind of deep transformation of corporate thinking. At its worst, it's greenwashing and, frankly, bullshit. Right? So it depends on how serious companies are and the standards they set themselves. I've read quite a bit about this recently, and there is also a need to recognise that you can't necessarily do everything. So maybe some companies are better focusing on the social side of things, social engagement and governance, and other, depending on the nature of the business, focusing on the environmental impact. But saying that we did a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of that, we ticked all the boxes, isn't going to be good enough anymore. So I think all companies that over a certain size are going to have to start complying with new EU rules on how they report their emissions. And that's going to be very important. I was at a lecture the other day, and there was an accountant accountant from Deloitte who said, kind of half in jest, that, you know, climate action, a lot of it is going to be done by accountants. But she's completely right. It is going to be done by accountants, and like everything else, it's going to come down to the professional standards that apply to accountants and to the various accreditation bodies that are used to demonstrate compliance. It's a kind of a nerdy policy area, but you're really right. Like, companies do have responsibilities, they have moral responsibilities, but they're often operating in a legal vacuum, and they're being pulled in different directions by, you know, their clients and by, you know, government statements and things like that. So clarity is very important. And I think when companies get that kind of clarity, I think we'll see a lot of change, actually, a lot of really good change, because that's a place where innovation happens, you know, as a matter of course, and it's very welcome and very important.
That's great. Thanks very much, guys.